Daniel Foster had doubted whether his plus-size bride could feed 20 hungry cowboys. But why did Martha's answer begin with taking off her brooch and ordering him out of the kitchen? Rain hammered the cookhouse roof as Martha rolled up her sleeves. 20 soaked cowboys waited outside. Cast-iron pans hissed, knives struck cutting boards, and Daniel stood frozen as she pointed toward the door. 7 o'clock, she said. What happened when those men finally lifted their spoons? Stay with us and tell us what you think. The stagecoach came into Cedar Hollow, with one wheel squealing and a hard September wind chasing dust down the main street. Daniel Foster stood beside the hitching rail outside Grady's General Store, with his hat pulled low and one hand resting on the neck of his bay gelding. He had been there 20 minutes already, though he would have denied watching the road that closely. The coach rounded the bend past the blacksmith shop. Daniel straightened. He knew almost nothing about the woman inside beyond what could fit on paper. Martha Collins, 32 years old, from Iowa. Widowed mother living with relatives near Council Bluffs. Good with figures. Could sew. Could cook. Could manage a household without much fuss, as she had put it. And there was one thing she had written in her final letter. I will wear a small blue ribbon at the collar of my traveling coat, so you will know me without having to call my name in front of strangers. The coach groaned to a stop. The driver set the brake. Leather harness creaked. One of the horses shook its head and sent foam from the bit onto the dirt. Daniel watched the door open. An elderly couple came down first, then a salesman with 2 sample cases, then a mother holding a sleeping boy against her shoulder. After them came Martha. Daniel saw the ribbon first. Blue, narrow, fastened neatly beneath her chin. Then he saw the rest of her. She was shorter than he had imagined, and considerably heavier. Her brown traveling dress fit plainly across a full waist and broad hips. Dust clung to the hem. Her coat was sensible rather than fashionable, and the leather boots beneath it had been polished recently, though the toes were worn pale from use. She paused on the coach step, one hand gripping the rail. For 2 seconds, Daniel did nothing. It was not a long time. Long enough. Martha looked directly at him. Her face did not fall. She did not blush or glance away. But something in her eyes went still. Behind Daniel, 2 young cowhands from a ranch south of town were leaning against the mercantile wall. One of them made a low sound through his teeth. The other whispered something Daniel did not catch. They both laughed. Martha heard them. Daniel could tell because her fingers tightened around the handle of the wooden box she was carrying. He stepped forward. Mrs. Collins? Miss Collins? Her voice was calm. Daniel removed his hat. Daniel Foster. I gathered. The corner of her mouth moved, though it did not become a smile. Daniel reached up for her free hand. Martha looked at it before taking it. His grip was careful as she stepped down, and the moment both boots touched the street, she released him. The coach driver climbed onto the roof and began untying baggage. 1 trunk, Martha said. Brown canvas, brass corners. And that? Daniel nodded toward the box held against her middle. I'll carry this. The box was old walnut, darkened by years of handling. One hinge had been repaired with a thin strip of tin. Daniel looked at it. Valuables? Recipes. He glanced at her. Martha met his eyes evenly. I don't trust strangers with either. The driver dropped her trunk down with enough force to make Daniel wince. Martha did not. Daniel lifted it himself. It was heavier than expected. You pack stones? Books. How many? Enough. He almost smiled. Almost. The young cowhands behind them had gone quiet now that Daniel was near enough to hear them clearly. He carried the trunk toward his wagon. Cedar Hollow was little more than one long street pressed between open range and the beginning of the foothills. A feed store stood beside the livery. The saloon doors slapped softly in the wind. Across from the barber shop, a woman was sweeping dust from a porch only to have the wind put half of it back. Martha followed Daniel without looking around much. That interested him. Most newcomers stared at everything. She seemed more concerned with where she was putting her feet. He lifted the trunk into the wagon bed and tied it against the sideboard with a length of rope. When he turned around, Martha was standing beside the rear wheel. She held the recipe box in both hands. "You can put that in back," he said. "No." Daniel waited. Martha added, "The road rough?" "Parts of it. Then I'll keep it." He nodded toward the wagon seat. She climbed up without asking for help. Again, Daniel noticed. Again, Martha noticed him noticing. He untied the bay and secured the horse behind the wagon, then climbed onto the driver's side and gathered the reins. For a moment, they sat without moving. The wind pushed a dry tumble of leaves along the street. Martha looked toward the general store, then toward the road leaving town. "How far?" "About 3 hours if Willow Creek isn't running high." "Is it?" "Wasn't yesterday." "Then 3 hours." Daniel gave the team a light slap of the reins. The wagon rolled north. Neither looked back at Cedar Hollow. For the first few miles, the road crossed open prairie, pale grass moving in long sheets beneath the wind. Farther west, the Bighorn Mountains rose dark and blue-gray, their highest ridges already showing streaks of early snow. Martha kept the recipe box on her lap. Her gloves were brown cloth, mended at one thumb with thread darker than the original fabric. Every so often, when the wagon struck a rut, her hands closed tighter around the box. Daniel tried twice to begin a conversation and abandoned both attempts before the words came out. He had written to her for nearly 5 months. On paper, it had been easier. "How many acres do you run? Do you attend church? What do you believe makes a good marriage? Do you like children? Do you expect affection before marriage or believe affection can grow afterward?" He had answered honestly. At least he had thought he had. Now, sitting less than 2 feet from the woman whose letters had rested beside his lamp all summer, Daniel found himself aware of every silence. Martha finally broke one. "Your letters said you raise Herefords." "Mostly." "How many head?" "Just under 900 after spring losses." She nodded as though storing the number. "You keep separate winter pasture?" "South Basin." "Hay?" "Enough if winter stays reasonable. And if it doesn't?" Daniel looked at her. She was watching the road. "We make do." Martha nodded again. The phrase seemed to satisfy her. An hour later, they stopped beside a shallow creek to water the horses. Daniel climbed down first. Martha remained on the seat, flexing one foot inside her boot. "Leg asleep?" "Since Iowa." That time he did smile, only briefly. Martha saw it. Something about her face softened. Daniel looked away first. He filled a tin cup from the water barrel fixed behind the wagon seat and handed it up to her. She drank, wiped the rim with her thumb, and returned it. "Thank you. You're welcome." The simplicity of it felt strangely formal. They moved on. By late afternoon, the land began to rise. Cottonwoods appeared along low washes, their leaves already turning yellow. The road narrowed between red-brown hills scattered with sage. Martha shifted once, carefully. Daniel noticed. "You need to stop?" "No." "We can." I said no. There was no sharpness in it, only certainty. Daniel let the team continue. Another mile passed. Then he said what he had been thinking since Cedar Hollow. The ranch isn't an easy place. Martha turned her head. Daniel kept his eyes on the horses. We're 3 hours from town in good weather. More in winter. There's mud in spring, dust all summer, snow deep enough some years to hide a fence rail. The hands work long days. I do too. Martha said nothing. Daniel continued because silence made him uneasy. The house is sound. Food's steady. You'll have your own room until we decide what comes next. There. He had said it. Not the marriage. What comes next? Martha's hands became very still on the recipe box. Ahead of them, the mountains caught the lowering sun, turning the upper slopes bronze while the valleys beneath them sank into shadow. The ranch isn't an easy place, Daniel said again, quieter now. This time Martha looked toward the mountains rather than at him. Neither was where I came from. Daniel turned slightly. She did not explain. For the next half hour, neither spoke. Near sundown, they crossed the last ridge. Broken Spur Ranch appeared below them. A broad main house with a deep front porch, 2 barns, a bunkhouse, corrals, smoke rising from the cookhouse chimney. Cattle scattered across the lower pasture like dark stones. Daniel watched Martha take it in. Her face gave him nothing, but her thumb moved slowly over the worn corner of the recipe box. He wondered what she saw. A home, a job, a mistake. Then Martha glanced at him, and Daniel understood, with an uncomfortable clarity, that she was wondering the same thing about him. He had gone to Cedar Hollow expecting to meet the woman he might marry. Martha Collins had arrived expecting to meet the man who had already chosen to try. Somewhere between the stagecoach and Broken Spur Ranch, she had discovered those were not quite the same thing. The wagon rolled through the main gate just after sunset. The hinges gave a long iron groan as Daniel pushed the gate open from the seat with a hooked pole he kept beneath the bench. Beyond it, the yard spread wide and practical. Packed dirt. 2 water troughs. A tack shed with a warped roof edge. Lantern light shining from the bunkhouse windows. Somewhere near the barn, a horse struck the inside of a stall with one impatient hoof. 3 men stopped talking when the wagon came in. Martha felt their eyes before she turned toward them. One was older, heavy through the shoulders, with gray beginning at his beard. Another looked no more than 20. The third was lean, red-haired, and smiling before there was anything to smile about. Daniel climbed down. George, the older man came forward. Thought you'd be back before dark. Road was rough near Willow Creek. George's gaze moved to Martha. Not quickly, not rudely. Daniel said, George Miller, foreman. Martha stepped down from the wagon before Daniel could come around to assist her. Mr. Miller, ma'am? George touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. That was all. It was the first greeting she had received since Cedar Hollow that carried neither surprise nor curiosity. Martha remembered him for it. The red-haired man did not bother hiding his interest. Daniel saw him looking. Roy. Roy Turner straightened. Just checking the wagon, boss. Then check the rear axle. It's been pulling left. Roy's smile thinned. Yes, sir. Martha almost looked at Daniel. Almost. Instead, she picked up the recipe box herself. Daniel carried her trunk to the house. Broken Spur's main house was larger than it had appeared from the ridge, though nothing about it was grand. The porch boards were wide and weathered smooth. Mud had dried in pale flakes beside the front steps. A pair of spurs hung from a nail near the door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke, saddle leather, and something boiled too long. Daniel set her trunk in the front hall. The spare room is upstairs. Martha looked toward the staircase. The spare room. For now. There was that phrase again. For now. Daniel removed his hat and ran a hand once through his dark hair. "We've written a good many letters," he said. "But letters aren't the same as living under one roof, no. I think it'd be sensible to give it a few weeks." Martha waited. Daniel shifted his weight. "To make certain this arrangement suits both of us." She looked at him long enough that he finally had to meet her eyes. Then she nodded once. "That's sensible." The answer seemed to relieve him. That bothered her more than if he had argued. He took the trunk upstairs. The room was small but clean. Iron bed, washstand, rag rug, one wooden chair, a narrow window facing west toward the barns. Fresh water stood in the pitcher beside a chipped white basin. Martha touched the quilt. It smelled faintly of sun. Someone had aired it. Daniel stood in the doorway. "If you need anything, say so." "I will. The privy is behind the kitchen garden. I saw it." He nodded. "Miller wakes the yard at 5. Breakfast's at 1:30. Who cooks?" "Frank Ellis. Good cook?" Daniel considered. "He can keep men fed." Martha gave him a look. "That wasn't what I asked." Daniel's mouth moved at one corner. Then, for the first time since Cedar Hollow, the air between them loosened. Only a little. Daniel went downstairs. Martha closed the door. Then she sat on the edge of the bed with her gloves still on. She stayed there for nearly a minute. No tears. No dramatics. Just the quiet sound of horses shifting outside and a wagon chain clinking in the yard. Then she stood, removed the blue ribbon from her collar, folded it carefully, and placed it inside the wooden recipe box. By 5 the next morning, she was awake. The ranch was still black outside except for a lantern moving near the barn. Martha dressed in a dark work skirt and plain cotton blouse, pinned her hair, and went downstairs. The kitchen was colder than the rest of the house. Frank Ellis was already there. He was a broad man in his 50s with a mustache like a broom and the expression of somebody who had been awake too long for most of his life. He looked at Martha. She looked at him. "Coffee?" he asked. "Please." He poured it into a thick enamel mug with a blue chip along the rim. Martha took one sip. Frank watched. "Well, it's strong. That's the point. It's also been boiling." Frank stared at her. Martha took another sip. "I've had worse." He grunted. That seemed to settle something between them. While he fried salt pork, Martha looked through the pantry. Not snooping, inventorying. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, coffee, molasses, salt, baking soda, a crate of onions, potatoes beginning to sprout, 2 jars of preserved peaches, 3 sacks of oats, 1 split flour sack folded over at the top and tied badly with twine. Martha took it down. Flour leaked from one corner. "Needle?" Frank pointed toward a drawer. She repaired the seam while the biscuits he had attempted browned too hard at the edges. Later, after breakfast, she walked the garden. It was barely a garden at all. Cabbages going woody. Half a row of carrots. Dry stalks from beans that should have been pulled weeks ago. Martha knelt and pushed 2 fingers into the soil. Behind her came Roy's voice. "Careful, ma'am. Wyoming dirt bites." She looked over her shoulder. Roy stood beside the fence with a saddle blanket over one arm. "Does it? Mostly eastern ladies. Iowa's not exactly the Atlantic coast." Roy smiled. "Still east of here." Martha pulled a weed from beside the carrots. "Most places are." The young hand beside Roy laughed before Roy could decide whether he had been insulted. Martha went back to work. By noon, she had cleared 1 row and found a patch of usable onions beneath dead leaves. By afternoon, she had learned where spare lamp oil was stored. which kitchen door stuck in damp weather, and that Daniel left his ranch books open on the desk in the small room beside the parlor. She had not intended to read them. Then she saw the receipt. A freight invoice from Cedar Hollow Supply Company, $48.60. The figure beneath it in Daniel's ledger read $88.60. Martha frowned. She checked the previous page, then the one before that. 2 feed deliveries, 1 fencing order, a payment to the farrier. Everything else matched. This one did not. She sat down. The chair creaked beneath her. She found a pencil in the drawer and began working through the column. Not changing anything. Checking. The front door opened sometime after sunset. Boots crossed the hall. Daniel appeared in the study doorway and stopped. Martha was still seated at his desk. The receipt lay beside the ledger. His face changed. Not anger exactly. Surprise first, then caution. Martha tapped the paper. Your August feed invoice is entered wrong. Daniel stepped closer. How wrong? $40. He picked up the receipt. Then the ledger. He checked the numbers twice. His jaw tightened. You're right. I know. That brought his eyes up. She folded her hands in her lap. Daniel looked at the pencil marks she had made on a loose scrap of paper. You did all this? It took 10 minutes. Why? Because the book was open. He almost laughed, but didn't. Martha rose. If you'd rather I not touch your accounts, say so. Daniel looked at the ledger again. No. She waited. He added, I'd rather not lose $40. That seems reasonable. She started toward the door. Martha. She stopped. It was the first time he had used her name without the careful distance of Miss Collins. When she turned, Daniel was still holding the receipt. You've done books before? My mother's boarding house kept accounts. Boarding house? Among other things. He studied her for a moment. Not her dress. Not her waist, her. Martha noticed the difference immediately. Daniel noticed that she noticed. Neither spoke. Then Martha said, Frank's flour sack won't leak anymore. Daniel blinked. What? And your carrots might survive if nobody tramples the south row. She walked past him into the hall. At the bottom of the stairs, she heard voices outside through the open kitchen window. Roy. Give her a week. Another man laughed. 2 if the mud stays dry. Martha stopped with one hand on the banister. Daniel had come out of the study behind her. He heard it too. Neither moved. Then Daniel stepped toward the door. Martha raised one hand, not touching him. Stopping him. Daniel looked at her. She shook her head once. Outside, Roy said something else too low to make out. Martha started up the stairs. You don't want me to handle that? Daniel asked quietly. She looked back down at him. No. Why not? Because I don't plan on leaving in a week. She continued upstairs. Daniel stayed where he was. The house settled around him in the evening cold. On the desk behind him lay the corrected figures. In the kitchen sat a flour sack that no longer leaked. Outside, men were wagering on how long Martha Collins would last. And for the first time since the stagecoach arrived, Daniel found himself wondering whether the person being tested at Broken Spur Ranch might not be Martha at all. The next few days settled into a rhythm neither of them had planned. Martha rose before sunrise. So did Daniel. The first morning they nearly collided in the downstairs hall, he carrying a lantern toward the back door, and she coming from the kitchen with an enamel mug of Frank's coffee. Daniel stopped. Martha stopped. The lantern flame moved between them. Morning, he said. Morning. He looked at the coffee. You've learned to tolerate it. I've learned to drink it before Frank notices my expression. From the kitchen came Frank's voice. I heard that. Daniel looked past her. Martha took another deliberate sip. Frank muttered something about people from Iowa having weak blood. Daniel went outside smiling. That smile stayed with Martha longer than she wanted it to. Frank Ellis discovered her baking 3 mornings later. He entered the kitchen at 5:20 with an armful of split wood and stopped dead. Martha had flour across one cheek. A bowl sat on the work table beside a tin of baking soda, a crock of lard, and a pitcher of sour milk. Frank stared at the dough, then at her. What's that? Biscuits. I make biscuits. Martha looked toward the blackened tray beside the stove. I've noticed. Frank put the wood down. My biscuits feed men. So will mine. They don't complain. That's because you're holding the frying pan. Frank's mustache twitched. Martha cut the dough with the rim of a small tin cup. If you want me to stop, say so. Frank looked at the neat circles, then at the stove. Don't burn 'em. He walked away. Martha smiled to herself. By 6:15, the first pan was beneath a clean cloth beside the coffee urn. The smell did the rest. Pete Lawson, the youngest hand on the ranch, appeared first. He came through the kitchen door rubbing his hands together. Cold morning. It is. Thought I'd get coffee. The pot's where it was yesterday. Pete poured himself a mug. His eyes moved toward the cloth. Martha said nothing. Pete waited, then lifted one corner. You make these? Someone did. He took one, then another. Second one's for Roy. Of course. Pete nodded solemnly and disappeared. Roy Turner arrived 3 minutes later. No biscuit. He leaned against the doorframe. Pete says you got something in here. Salt's on the second shelf. I don't need salt. Coffee? Had some. Martha kept slicing bacon. Roy looked toward the covered pan. My gloves might be in here. Martha glanced at his back pocket. Brown leather gloves protruded almost halfway out. Possibly. Roy followed her eyes. He pulled the gloves free and looked at them. Well, I'll be. Martha turned back to the stove. Roy took a biscuit on his way out. By the end of the week, Frank had stopped pretending the biscuits were an intrusion. He still cooked the main meals. Martha did not try to take that from him. But she started helping where the kitchen had gaps. Bread, biscuits, a pan of molasses cookies made from the last of a jar Frank claimed had been sitting around useless. She cleaned the spice tins and relabeled 2 of them because someone had put cloves in a container marked pepper. She did not ask who, Frank said. Wasn't me. Martha said, I didn't ask. It wasn't. Then we're both satisfied. Men began drifting through. Not all at once. Never enough to admit they were doing it. George Miller came for coffee after checking the south fence. Pete wanted to know whether there were any broken biscuit pieces that couldn't rightly be served. Caleb Dunn claimed he needed hot water for a stiff leather strap. Roy sometimes appeared without any excuse at all. Martha never mentioned the wager. Neither did they. She learned their habits instead. George drank coffee black and left half an inch in the bottom every time. Pete swallowed food too fast whenever he was nervous. Roy talked more when he was tired. Henry Cole did not talk much at all. Henry had worked cattle longer than some of the younger men had been alive. His beard was mostly white, his shoulders permanently bent from years in the saddle, and he moved with a careful stiffness on cold mornings. Martha noticed him one evening at supper. Frank had served jerky fried with potatoes. Henry cut a small piece, chewed, stopped, then quietly moved the meat to the side of his plate. No complaint, no request. Martha saw it from the kitchen. The next day, she set aside a portion of beef before Frank dried the rest. She simmered it longer in gravy with onions until it could be cut with the edge of a fork. At supper, she placed it near Henry without comment. He looked at the plate, then at her. Martha was already moving away. The following morning, a handful of peppermint leaves appeared beside her recipe box. No note. Henry walked past the kitchen window carrying a coil of rope and did not look inside. Martha dried the leaves by the stove. That evening she made tea. Daniel began noticing other things. Men stayed longer after supper now. Before Martha came, the bunkhouse cleared quickly. They ate, wiped their mouths, and disappeared toward cards, chores, or bed. Now someone might sit another 10 minutes, then 15. Pete told a story about falling into a watering trough when he was 12. George corrected half of it. Roy insisted he'd once seen a mule kick open a saloon door in Laramie. Frank said Roy had never been to Laramie. Roy said that was beside the point. Martha sat at the far end of the table repairing a tear in an apron and listened without trying to become part of anything. That seemed to make it easier for them to include her. Daniel stood outside one evening after checking the barn doors. He heard laughter through the dining room window. Real laughter. Not the sharp kind he had heard at Cedar Hollow. This one rolled warm through the house. He stopped on the porch. For a moment he did not open the door. His younger brother, Samuel, had laughed like that. Too loud. Head thrown back. Never ashamed to enjoy anything. Samuel had been dead 5 years. A horse had stumbled during a spring drive north of Powder River. By the time they brought him home, Daniel's mother had already lit the parlor lamps. After that, the house grew quieter. Not immediately. Quiet came slowly. A chair left unused. A joke no one finished. Then meals taken separately. Then a room whose door stayed closed. Daniel had become accustomed to it without deciding to. Now Martha's voice came through the window. No, Roy. If the mule opened the saloon door, someone opened it first. I saw what I saw. You said you weren't there. That doesn't mean I don't know what happened. The table erupted again. Daniel stood with one hand resting on the door latch. He looked through the glass. Martha was laughing. Not loudly. She had one hand near her mouth, her head bent slightly. Lamplight caught the soft curve of her cheek. Daniel had not expected that. He had expected competence, perhaps kindness, perhaps endurance. He had not expected her to change the sound of the house. He opened the door. Conversation dipped for half a second. Then George slid his chair aside. Coffee's still hot. Daniel poured a cup. There was one biscuit left beneath the cloth. Roy reached for it. Daniel reached at the same time. Both men stopped. Roy slowly withdrew his hand. Boss. Daniel took the biscuit. Martha watched from across the room. He broke it open. Still warm inside. You made these? I did. They're good. Martha's needle paused. That's a dangerous thing to admit. Why? Frank might hear you. From the kitchen came a pan striking the counter. I heard him. The men laughed again. Daniel did too. Later, after everyone left, Martha gathered the mugs. Daniel stayed behind. You don't have to do that. I know. You've already been working all day. So have you. He picked up 2 mugs. Martha looked at him. Daniel carried them to the kitchen. No speech. No offer to rescue her from the work. He simply put the mugs beside the wash basin and came back for more. Martha watched him make 3 trips. On the last one, their hands touched briefly around the handle of George's chipped cup. Daniel released it first. Good night, Martha. Good night, Daniel. He walked toward the hall. Martha wiped the table slowly after he left. She could feel herself becoming comfortable. That was the dangerous part. The kitchen door no longer felt like a boundary. The ranch hands had begun saying her name instead of calling her the Eastern lady. Frank had started leaving the flour scoop where she preferred it. Henry's peppermint hung drying by the stove. Daniel laughed more often now, though sometimes he seemed to catch himself afterward, as if he had broken a private rule. Martha could see the change. She could also see what followed it. Whenever Daniel found himself enjoying her presence too easily, he pulled back. He stayed later at the barn. He spoke about cattle when conversation became personal, and once, when Martha caught him watching her across the supper table, he lowered his eyes so quickly that she knew the look had meant something he was not prepared to examine. Outside, September was changing. The afternoon wind carried a colder edge down from the bighorns. Clouds gathered earlier over the mountains. One evening, Frank stood in the cookhouse doorway, rubbing his left wrist. "Weather coming," he said. Martha looked west. The sky above the mountains had turned the color of old iron. "Looks like it." Frank nodded toward the corrals. "North crew's still out." "When are they due back?" 3 days. A gust struck the side of the building hard enough to rattle the window. Martha watched dust race across the yard. Somewhere beyond the ridge, thunder rolled. Then Daniel came out of the barn and looked toward the mountains. He did not move for several seconds. Martha saw his expression change. Whatever warmth had been growing quietly inside Broken Spur Ranch was about to be tested by something larger than any of them had planned for. By supper, the wind had turned sharp. Rain came after dark, not the gentle kind that settled into the ground. This rain struck the windows hard and sideways, driven down from the mountains in long, cold sheets. The barn doors had been barred. Extra lanterns burned in the yard. George Miller and Daniel crossed between buildings with their coat collars turned high, checking latches, moving tack, making sure nothing loose could become dangerous in the night. Martha stood inside the cookhouse with Frank Ellis and listened to the roof drum. Frank stirred a pot of beans. "North crew should have turned back by noon," he said. Martha looked toward the dark window. "You think they did?" Frank shrugged. "If they had sense." Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the foothills. Then came the sound of horses. Not one or two. Many. Frank stopped stirring. Martha went to the window. Lanterns swung through the rain. Men shouted in the yard. Horses came in dark and slick, blowing hard, mud to their knees. The North crew had returned. 3 days early. Daniel was already outside when Martha reached the cookhouse door. "Easy with that mare. Get the gray into the south stall. George, count heads." The whole yard moved at once. Men dismounted stiffly, some barely lifting their legs over the saddle. Their coats streamed water. Mud had worked into their boots and up the backs of their trousers. One man led a limping horse. Another carried a torn bedroll under his arm. Then a supply wagon came through the gate too fast. The left wheel hit a rut. The wagon lurched. Frank stepped off the cookhouse porch just as someone yelled. He turned. The wagon tongue swung sideways. Frank jumped back, but his boot slipped in the mud. He went down hard. Martha heard the crack of wood, a shout. Then Daniel's voice. "Hold the team!" She was across the yard before she decided to move. Frank was sitting in the mud with one arm pulled tight against his chest. His face had gone gray. "Don't touch it!" he snapped when George crouched beside him. Martha knelt. "Can you move your fingers?" Frank glared at her. "That how you say hello?" "Move them." He did. Slowly. The wrist was already swelling. Daniel crouched on the other side. "Broken?" "Could be," Martha said. at least badly sprained. Frank tried to stand. Pain caught him halfway up. He swore under his breath and sat again. Daniel looked toward the cookhouse, then toward the men in the yard. There were nearly 20 now. The regular crew plus the North Riders, all of them soaked, all of them hungry. George said, "Cattle broke north near Coyote Ridge. We got most of them turned, but there's still a few hundred scattered along the upper draw." Daniel's face tightened. At first light? Before. Another man came up behind George. "We'll need trail food." Daniel looked toward the sky. Rain hammered the brim of his hat. "When did you last eat?" "Before noon." Daniel nodded once. "Get dry. Take care of the horses. Supper soon as we can manage it." Frank laughed once. Not because anything was funny. "Good luck with that." Daniel looked at him. Frank lifted the injured wrist. "This hand ain't doing anything tonight." For half a second, the whole problem seemed to settle in the space between them. Martha stood. Rain had soaked the shoulders of her dress. Loose strands of hair clung to her cheek. Daniel looked at her, then at the cookhouse, then back at her. Too many men were near enough to hear. That should have made him choose his words more carefully. It didn't. "Can you actually feed this many men?" The yard seemed to quiet around the question. Not completely. Rain still struck the roofs. Horses still shifted in the barn. Someone dragged a saddle across wet boards. But Martha heard the pause. She heard Roy Turner, too. He stood beneath the bunkhouse awning, wringing water from his hat. "Might want to keep the coffee hot," he said. "Supper could take till breakfast." A couple of the younger men gave short laughs. Not cruel, exactly, but close enough. Daniel's jaw tightened. Roy. Roy looked away. Too late. Martha stood very still. She had heard questions like Daniel's before. Could she manage the stairs? Could she keep up? Would she tire? Was she sure she wanted work like that? Always spoken in a careful tone. Always dressed as concern. Always carrying the same little weight underneath. She looked at Daniel. He was waiting for an answer. Not mocking her. Not intentionally. That somehow made it worse. Martha reached up and unfastened the small metal brooch at her collar. It was plain brass with a blue enamel center. The piece she had worn through Iowa, across Nebraska, and into Cedar Hollow. She stepped into the cookhouse. Daniel followed. So did George. Roy stayed near the doorway. Martha laid the brooch carefully beside the flour barrel. Then she rolled her sleeves above her elbows. "What hour do they eat?" Daniel looked at her. 7. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 5:23. Frank, still pale, sat on a chair near the stove with his arm wrapped against his chest. Martha walked to the pantry, opened it, closed it, then opened the cold cupboard. She looked back at Daniel. "How many?" 19, including us. Men leaving before dawn? At least 12. How early? 4:30. Martha nodded. "Coffee needs to stay on all night." Daniel waited. She pointed toward the door. "Then get out of my kitchen." George coughed into his fist. Roy's eyebrows went up. Daniel did not move. Martha looked at him again. "Unless you plan to peel potatoes." He glanced toward Frank. Frank leaned back in the chair. "Don't look at me." She's right. Daniel removed his wet coat. "Where's the knife?" Martha handed him one. The room changed. Not all at once, but enough. George went to fetch beef. Pete Lawson carried in 2 buckets of water. Another boy brought wood. Martha opened the flour barrel, checked the salt pork, counted onions, tested the potatoes, and set 3 pans on the stove. Her movements were fast, not rushed. There was a difference. George cut the beef small, smaller than that. He adjusted without argument. Pete, water first, then bring every clean tin plate you can find. Yes, ma'am. Daniel. He looked up from the potatoes. Thin slices. I know how to cut a potato. She looked at the thick piece in his hand. Apparently not. George smiled. Daniel looked at the potato, then sliced it thinner. Outside, the storm kept beating on Broken Spur Ranch. Inside, heat began to build. Martha rendered salt pork into one pan, started beans in another and filled the large stew pot with stock bones, beef scraps, onions, and enough water to give herself room later. Frank watched her from the chair. After 10 minutes, he said, "You're making too much." No. That's a lot of stew. They haven't eaten since noon. Frank opened his mouth, closed it. Martha handed him a spoon. Taste that. He did. Needed salt. She added it before he spoke. Frank looked at her, then at Daniel. Daniel was watching too. That irritated Martha. Potatoes, she said. He looked down and went back to work. By 6, the cookhouse windows had fogged. Wet coats hung near the stove. The smell of beef, onions, coffee, and hot bread began escaping through every crack in the building. Men started appearing at the doorway. Martha sent them away. 7. Pete came back at 6:15. Just checking. Check somewhere else. At 6:30, Roy appeared. He did not speak. He looked at the stove, then at Martha, then at Daniel peeling the last of the potatoes. Roy smiled. Daniel pointed the knife at him. One word, and you're washing every pan. Roy disappeared. At 6:45, Martha pressed the back of her wrist against her forehead. Her sleeves were dusted with flour. Her cheeks were red from the stove. Daniel noticed she had not stopped moving once. You need a minute? No. You've been standing since... Daniel. He stopped. She looked at him. If you want to help, put those plates on the table. He did. 7 o'clock came with the rain still striking the roof. The men filed into the dining room in damp shirts and clean socks, hair still wet from washing. They expected something. Martha could feel it. Maybe failure. Maybe a joke. Maybe an apology. She gave them none. George carried in the stew. Pete brought the potatoes. Martha set out beans, hot biscuits, cornbread, and the dried apple cobbler she had managed to fit into the oven, beside everything else. Last came coffee. She stood near the kitchen doorway, with her hands folded loosely at her waist. Daniel sat at the end of the table. Roy took the first spoonful. Henry Cole broke open a biscuit. Steam rose. Someone poured gravy over potatoes. Then came the sound Martha least expected. Nothing. No jokes. No remarks. No whispers. Just spoons scraping tin bowls. Forks touching plates. Coffee being poured. Rain against the glass. Martha watched the men eat. Daniel looked down the table, then across the room toward her. For the first time since she stepped off the stage in Cedar Hollow, he was not looking at her as though he were trying to decide whether she could manage Broken Spur Ranch. He was looking at the room she had taken hold of in less than 2 hours. Martha met his eyes. Then one of the men reached for a second biscuit, and another pushed his empty bowl forward. The silence had answered Daniel's question before Martha ever needed to. For several seconds, nobody seemed willing to be the first man to spoil it. Rain hammered the cookhouse roof. Boots shifted beneath the long table. Tin spoons scraped the last streaks of gravy from bowls that had been filled only minutes earlier. Then Pete Lawson cleared his throat. "Ma'am?" Martha looked over. "More stew?" She glanced at the pot. "Bring your bowl." Pete stood so fast his chair legs dragged across the floor. That broke whatever spell had settled over the room. 3 more men rose, then 5. George Miller laughed under his breath and pushed his own empty bowl toward Daniel. "Looks like you're closest." Daniel stared at him. "I'm not serving. You peeled potatoes?" "Poorly," Martha said from the doorway. A few men laughed. Daniel looked toward her. There was flour on the front of her apron, and a dark strand of hair had worked loose against her cheek. Her face showed no triumph. She looked tired more than anything else. That unsettled him. He had expected satisfaction. Instead, Martha lifted the stew lid and went back to work. "1 serving each until everybody's had seconds," she said. "Then you can fight over what's left." "No fighting in the cookhouse," Frank said from his chair. His injured wrist now rested in a sling George had fashioned from a clean flour cloth. Martha looked at him. "Then you'd better guard the cobbler." Frank pulled the dish closer with his good hand. "First useful thing you've said all evening." The room loosened. Men started talking again, not loudly at first. It came back in pieces. Someone asked who had the northern fence assignment at dawn. Someone else complained that his socks were still wet. Roy Turner said nothing. He ate another biscuit. Martha noticed. So did Daniel. By 7:30, most of the stew was gone. The fried potatoes had disappeared completely. Only crumbs remained from the cornbread. The beans had been scraped nearly clean from the serving bowl, and Pete had positioned himself suspiciously close to the cobbler. Martha caught him. "Don't!" "I wasn't. You were thinking about it." Pete looked genuinely offended. "Can a man be blamed for thinking?" "Usually." George laughed into his coffee. Daniel found himself watching Martha move through the room. She never hurried without reason. When a plate needed filling, she filled it. When Frank tried to stand, she pushed a mug toward him and told him to remain where he was. When one of the North Riders started coughing after coming in too cold and too fast, she set hot coffee beside him without interrupting the conversation around the table. Small things. Daniel had always thought running a ranch was mostly the management of large things. Cattle, land, money, weather, men. Martha seemed to notice everything that existed between those categories. A man who needed another blanket. A wet coat dripping too close to the stove. A coffee pot going empty before anyone asked. A plate that had been pushed aside because its owner was too tired to finish cutting the meat. She handled each problem before it had time to become one. Daniel leaned back in his chair. George followed his gaze. "You going to eat?" Daniel looked down. His own bowl was barely touched. "I am." "Could have fooled me." Daniel picked up his spoon. Across the table, Roy finally spoke. "Biscuits are good." Nobody answered him. Roy looked around. "What?" Pete grinned. "Sounded painful. Shut up." Roy tore another biscuit in half. Martha turned toward the stove before anyone could see the small change at the corner of her mouth. At 8, George began organizing the men for the morning ride. The scattered cattle near Coyote Ridge could not be left long. If the storm broke before dawn, 12 riders would leave by 4:30 with spare ropes, slickers, ammunition, and enough food to last through the day. Martha heard him discussing provisions with Daniel. "Frank usually packs jerky and hard biscuits," George said. Martha looked up from the wash basin. "How many men?" 12. "How long out?" "Could be all day. Jerky isn't enough after tonight." George glanced at Daniel. Daniel did not answer for her. That mattered. Martha wiped her hands. I'll have food ready. George looked toward the clock. You'll need to start around 3. I know. You've been working since before 5. I know that too. Daniel stood. I can have Pete help. Pete's head came up from across the room. Martha considered. At 3:30. Pete's enthusiasm vanished. 3:30? Unless you'd prefer 4. No, ma'am. 3:30 sounds fine. The men laughed. By 8:30, they began drifting toward the bunkhouse. Henry Cole was among the last to leave. He moved slowly, one hand resting against the back of a chair while he straightened. Martha was stacking plates. Henry picked up the final biscuit. He broke it open. A little steam still rose from the center. He looked at it longer than a biscuit deserved. Then he said, "My wife made them this way." The room became quieter. Not completely. The rain was still there. Frank shifted in his chair. Daniel stood near the stove. But Henry's voice had changed enough that nobody interrupted him. "Been 12 years, he added. Martha looked at him. Henry's eyes remained on the biscuit. She used a little more lard than most folks. Made 'em soft inside. Martha reached for the butter crock. She slid it closer to him. "Then don't eat it dry." Henry looked up. Their eyes met. He nodded once. "Night, Mrs. Collins." "Good night, Henry." He left with the biscuit in his hand. Nobody commented. Martha began clearing the remaining dishes. Daniel joined her. She handed him a stack without looking. "Those go beside the basin." He carried them over. Frank watched the two of them. "I feel useless." Martha pointed toward the table. "You're injured. I've been injured before, and probably made yourself worse every time." Frank frowned. Daniel almost smiled. Frank noticed. "Something amusing." "No." "You're smiling." "No, I'm not." "You are." Martha turned away before either man saw her expression. At 9, she sent Frank to the main house because his wrist had swollen badly enough that Daniel wanted it examined in Cedar Hollow once the roads cleared. At 9:15, Pete finished carrying water. At 9:30, George checked the stove and left for the barn. By 10, the cookhouse was empty except for Martha and Daniel. The sudden quiet felt larger after so many men. Martha rolled her shoulders once. Daniel saw it. "You should stop." She kept scrubbing the stockpot. "I will." "When?" "When it's clean. You've got to be up before 3. Then standing here discussing sleep isn't helping." Daniel took the drying cloth. Martha looked at him. He began wiping a plate. "You don't have to." "I know." The answer echoed something she had told him days earlier. For several minutes they worked without speaking. Water sloshed in the basin. A log settled inside the stove. Outside, the rain weakened to a steady tapping along the eaves. Daniel dried another plate. "I didn't know." Martha's hands slowed. "Know what? That you could do all that." She looked into the dark water. That was the problem. Daniel stopped drying. Martha lifted the pot and scrubbed harder at a patch of cooked-on broth. "I wasn't hiding anything. I didn't say you were." "No, you just assumed." His jaw tightened slightly. She continued before he could answer. "You saw me get off that stage and you decided there were questions that needed asking." "Martha, I'm tired, Daniel." Her voice wasn't raised. That stopped him more effectively than anger would have. She rinsed the stockpot. Daniel set the plate down. "I meant what I said earlier as a practical question." "I know. There were 19 men. I counted. Frank was hurt. I noticed." I wasn't trying to insult you. Martha finally looked at him. I know that too. Daniel had no answer for that. She dried her hands on her apron. That's what makes it difficult. He watched her untie the apron and hang it on a peg. The brooch still rested beside the flour barrel, blue enamel catching the low stove light. Martha picked it up. She did not put it back on. She closed it inside her palm. You asked whether I could feed them because you genuinely weren't sure. Daniel looked down at the plate in his hands. Yes. She nodded. No accusation. That felt worse. Martha went to the door. Behind her, Daniel said, You did more than feed them. She stopped. For one moment, he thought she might turn around. She didn't. I wasn't cooking to prove anything to them. Then she opened the door and stepped into the cold night. Daniel stayed beside the wash basin. The last plate in his hand had already been dry for nearly a minute. Outside, Martha crossed the yard alone, her skirt brushing wet grass where the rain had washed mud from the path. Daniel watched through the window until she reached the main house. He thought about Roy's joke, the men's laughter, the silence when supper arrived, Henry's biscuit, the way every empty bowl had come back for more. He had believed the evening ended with Martha proving the ranch hands wrong. Standing alone in the cookhouse, Daniel finally understood that the judgment she had carried all evening had not belonged to Roy Turner. It had belonged to him. He stayed there after Martha left. The stove had settled into a low red glow. Water in the basin had gone cloudy with grease and flour. One damp towel hung over the chair back. Her blue brooch was gone from beside the flour barrel. Daniel looked toward the door. He could have followed her. He did not. Some apologies came too quickly because the person giving them wanted relief more than forgiveness. Daniel knew enough about stubborn men to recognize when he was about to become one of them. So he finished drying the dishes. At 2:40 the next morning, Martha came downstairs. The house was dark except for the banked fire in the kitchen. She had slept perhaps 3 hours. Her back ached from the previous day. Her hands felt swollen when she buttoned her work dress. She tied her hair more tightly than usual, washed her face in cold water, and stood for several seconds with both palms pressed against the edge of the basin. Then she went to work. Daniel heard her before he saw her. The cookhouse door opened. Wood shifted. The iron stove door clanged softly. By 3, light showed through the small window. He dressed and crossed the yard. Martha was already mixing biscuit dough. She did not look surprised to see him. Coffee isn't ready. I didn't come for coffee. She kept working. Daniel took off his coat. What needs doing? For a moment she said nothing. Then she nodded toward the table. Those apples. He looked at the basket. What about them? Slice them. For breakfast? For the men going north? Daniel picked up the paring knife. Martha said, Thin. He looked at her. She raised one eyebrow. You're still under observation. Something in his chest loosened, though her face remained serious. He began slicing. At 3:30, Pete arrived looking as though he had been personally betrayed by the existence of mourning. His hair stood crooked beneath his hat. Ma'am. Water. Yes, ma'am. He yawned. After you wake up. Pete opened his eyes wider, already awake. Daniel glanced at him. Pete took both buckets and disappeared. By 4:15, Martha had biscuits wrapped in cloth, pieces of cold beef, dried apples, and small paper twists of salt packed into saddle sacks. Coffee filled 2 heavy tin jugs wrapped with wool scraps to hold heat. George came through the door fully dressed for rain. That's more than Frank sends. Martha tied the final sack shut. They'll eat it. George took the bags. His eyes moved briefly toward Daniel. Daniel said nothing. That mattered too. The riders left before first light. Hooves faded up the north road, muffled by wet earth. Martha stood beneath the cookhouse awning until the last lantern disappeared. Then she went inside and started breakfast for the men who remained. The storm weakened around noon. By afternoon, Broken Spur looked washed clean and miserable. Water filled the wagon ruts. The corrals were dark with mud. Clouds dragged low against the foothills, but a pale strip of sky had opened above the western ridge. Frank's wrist had swollen enough that Daniel hitched the light buggy after breakfast and sent him to Cedar Hollow with George's nephew, Will. That left Martha in charge of the cookhouse. Nobody formally announced it. Nobody needed to. Roy came in at noon and found her making potato soup. He stood near the doorway longer than necessary. Need anything? Martha looked over. Are you offering? Roy shifted. I suppose. Bring wood. He nodded. No joke. No complaint. When he returned, he stacked the split logs beside the stove more neatly than Frank ever did. Martha noticed. She did not thank him until he had finished. That'll do. Roy rubbed his palms against his trousers. About last night. Martha kept stirring. He waited, then apparently decided courage had limits. Soup smells good. It isn't finished. He nodded. Right. He left. Martha watched the door close behind him. Some men apologized with words. Others carried wood. She had learned not to confuse the two, but she had also learned that either could be a beginning. That evening, the North Riders returned with most of the scattered cattle gathered. They were wet again, but not nearly as exhausted. George came through the cookhouse carrying the empty food sacks. Not much left. Good. Pete appeared behind him. Caleb ate 2 men's share. That's a lie, Caleb Dunn said from outside. You ate my apple. You dropped it. I set it down. On my saddle. The argument continued toward the bunkhouse. Martha smiled despite herself. George set the folded cloths on the counter. Food made a difference. She nodded. Then he lowered his voice. Daniel knows it. Martha glanced at him. George did not add anything. He had known Daniel too long to explain him for him. At supper, second helpings disappeared again. Not because anyone was trying to make a point. The novelty had worn off. That was better. Men simply ate. Henry Cole sat near the end of the table with his hat hanging from the chair back. Martha had made biscuits again. Not the same meal as the storm supper. That would have looked like performance. Tonight, there was beef hash, beans, pickled onions, biscuits, and stewed peaches. Henry picked up a biscuit, broke it. Steam rose between his fingers. He smiled faintly. My Emma made hers just about like these. Martha moved the butter dish closer. Henry looked at her. You did that last night. You didn't use enough. He spread more. Bossy woman, so I've been told. Henry chuckled. Across the table, Roy looked at his plate. No one laughed at Martha. No one looked toward Daniel to see whether he would. The room had moved past that. That was when Daniel understood the depth of what had changed. The men were no longer behaving politely because she was his guest. They were beginning to treat her as Martha. The distinction made him uncomfortable in ways he could not yet name. After supper, most of the men left for the bunkhouse. Henry carried his own plate to the kitchen. Martha reached for it. He held on. I can set down a plate. I didn't say you couldn't. He placed it beside the basin. Then he pulled something from his vest pocket. A small paper packet. Peppermint. Martha looked at it. More? Creek bank's full of it. He shrugged. Emma used it after a long day. Said it settled a person. Martha accepted the packet. Thank you. Henry put on his hat. Night. When he left, Martha opened the paper. The smell came up clean and sharp. Daniel stood near the far end of the table. He had heard the exchange. Martha folded the paper again. I'll dry it tomorrow. Daniel nodded. He wanted to say something. She could see it. He moved one mug, then moved it back. Finally he said, I was wrong. Martha looked at him. There was no one else in the room now, only the low crackle of the stove and the ticking sound of cooling iron. Daniel took off his hat. I should have said it last night. You said you didn't know. That's not the same thing. No. He looked down at the brim in his hands. When you stepped off that stage, I had an idea in my head. Martha did not move. Daniel continued. Not a fair one. The room seemed to get smaller. He did not say the word. Heavy, large, different. He did not need to. Martha had lived long enough to recognize what men meant when they became careful around plain truths. Daniel looked back at her. I pictured someone else. Martha's mouth tightened slightly. And when you saw me, I hesitated. I noticed. I know. He set the hat on the table. Then I spent the next days watching to see whether you could keep up. Martha's hand closed around the peppermint packet. Yes. Daniel rubbed his thumb along the table edge. I told myself I was being practical. You were. He looked at her. She held his gaze. That's what hurt. Daniel went still. Martha set the peppermint down. My mother ran a boarding house outside Council Bluffs after my father died. He listened. Near a freight road. Not a fine place, so 6 rooms when we started. 9 later. Railroad men when crews came through. Drovers, salesmen, teamsters. Families when weather stopped them. Daniel pulled out a chair. He did not sit until she did. Martha remained standing. So did he. I was 17 when father died, she said. By 18 I could feed 20 men before sunrise and have dinner ready when twice that many came through after dark. Daniel's eyes moved toward the stove. Martha saw it. Yes. I know how to use one. I believe you now. The word landed quietly. Daniel accepted it. She continued. Men liked the food. They liked the pies. They liked the bread. They liked telling my mother she was lucky to have a daughter built for kitchen work. Daniel's jaw tightened. Martha looked toward the dark window. One man asked to court me when I was 23. He told me I'd make an excellent wife because I'd never starve him. She gave a small humorless laugh. Then he asked whether I'd mind staying home when his friends visited. Daniel's eyes returned to her. She did not look at him. There was another a few years later. Nicer man. Or I thought so. He said he admired women who were useful. He said it often. Martha ran one finger along the fold in the peppermint paper. He also said I shouldn't wear pale colors because they made me look larger. The stove clicked. Neither moved. I stopped answering men who praised what I could do before they knew who I was. Daniel said quietly, Is that why you didn't write about the boarding house? Yes. Or your cooking? Yes. She finally looked at him. I wanted one man to meet Martha Collins before he decided what category I belonged in. Daniel's face changed. Not much. Enough. Martha went on. I told you I could manage a household. I told you I understood accounts. I told you I wasn't afraid of work. You did. But I didn't tell you how many men I'd fed or how much money I helped my mother make because I didn't want to arrive here as a kitchen." Daniel flinched almost invisibly. Martha saw it. Good. Not because she wanted to hurt him, because she needed him to understand. She stepped around the table. "I came west hoping for a husband, Daniel." He looked up. "I didn't come west to audition." Silence. Daniel opened his mouth. Nothing came. Martha picked up the peppermint packet and her folded apron. At the door, she stopped, not turning around. "I know you didn't mean to be cruel." That was almost harder to hear. Then she went out. The door closed softly behind her. Daniel stood in the cookhouse with his hat on the table and his apology still unfinished. Outside, the clouds had broken apart. Moonlight lay silver across the wet ranch yard. Martha crossed toward the main house alone. She did not hurry. Daniel watched through the window but did not follow. For once, restraint was the only useful thing he could give her. He had spent weeks wondering whether Martha Collins could fit into the life he had built. Tonight, she had finally shown him the question beneath all his questions. Not whether she was capable of becoming his wife, whether he was capable of becoming a man she could trust enough to choose. Daniel did not follow her to the house that night. The next morning, Martha noticed the loose cookhouse step was gone. Not gone exactly. Repaired. The board had been lifted, squared against the frame, and fastened with 2 new nails driven clean through fresh-cut wedges beneath it. Someone had even planed the rough edge that had caught the toe of her boot twice during the previous week. Martha stood on the step with a basket of onions against her hip. She looked toward the barn. Daniel was inside somewhere. She could hear hammering from a stall and George calling for a length of rope. Martha tested the board with 1 foot. Solid. No note. No explanation. She went inside. Frank returned from Cedar Hollow shortly before noon, with his wrist wrapped in stiff splints and a physician's instruction not to use the hand for several weeks. He was in a foul mood. "Doctor says rest." Martha set a cup of coffee in front of him. "Then rest." Frank looked offended. "You sound like him. That should worry you." He drank the coffee. By afternoon, he had appointed himself supervisor of everything Martha was doing. "Beans need more salt." "No." "Fire's running cool." "It isn't." "You're cutting those onions thick." Martha put the knife down. "Frank." He stopped. "You may supervise the coffee." His eyebrows rose. "Just the coffee? Until you learn to be pleasant. I'll be dead first. Then enjoy the coffee." From the doorway, Daniel made a quiet sound that might have been a laugh. Martha looked over. He had come in carrying a wooden crate from the storeroom. Their eyes met. The warmth disappeared from his face almost immediately. Not from anger, from caution. He set the crate on the floor. George found more potatoes in the root cellar. "Good. Some are soft. I'll sort them." Daniel nodded. He seemed about to say more. Instead, he turned to Frank. "How's the wrist?" "Attached." "Doctor say anything useful?" "Apparently I'm supposed to become decorative." Martha went back to chopping. Daniel stayed another moment, then left. That became the pattern. He did not avoid her. But he stopped reaching for conversations simply because silence made him uncomfortable. At breakfast, he asked about supplies. At supper, he asked whether Frank needed anything from Cedar Hollow. When Martha spoke, Daniel listened. When she did not, he let the quiet remain. It was a small change. She noticed every bit of it. 2 days later, she came into the dining room carrying a pot of stew and found Daniel standing behind his chair. The other men were already seated. George had his coffee. Pete was trying to steal a biscuit from under the cloth. Roy was arguing with Frank about whether a horse could recognize its own reflection. Daniel remained standing. Martha set the pot down. Something wrong? No. He looked toward the empty chair near the end of the table. Her chair. Martha understood. He was waiting for her. She had spent most evenings eating after everyone else or standing near the kitchen counter between jobs. No one had asked her to. It had simply been easier. Tonight, Daniel waited. So did everyone else once they realized he was waiting. Martha wiped her hands on her apron. This is foolish. Daniel pulled out her chair. Probably. Pete stopped reaching for the biscuit. Martha gave him a look. His hand retreated. Then she sat. Only after she did, Daniel sat too. Nobody mentioned it. George passed the beans. Roy asked Frank whether decorative men were still allowed second helpings. Conversation resumed. But Martha ate the entire meal at the table. That evening, after the men returned to the bunkhouse, Daniel remained in the dining room. Martha collected plates. He took 2 from her hands. You don't have to, I know. He carried them to the kitchen. Martha followed. For several minutes, they worked in silence. It was not like the silence after the storm supper. That one had been full of things neither of them understood how to say. This one felt more careful. Daniel dried a plate. Martha rinsed another. Finally, he said, "The step was me." I assumed. It needed fixing. It did. He dried the plate longer than necessary. I saw you catch your boot on it. I noticed you noticed. Daniel set the plate aside. Martha almost smiled. He looked at her. She let the smile disappear before it grew. Daniel. He waited. You don't need to repair every board on the ranch to apologize. I know. Do you? Probably not. She turned toward him. He was serious. That made it harder to remain annoyed. Daniel put the towel down. When you stepped off the coach, I was disappointed. Martha's fingers stopped in the dishwater. He continued before he could lose the nerve. Not because of anything you had done. She looked at him. That doesn't improve it. No. He took the correction without defending himself. I had built a woman in my mind from your letters. What did she look like? Daniel hesitated. Martha waited. Smaller. She gave a short breath through her nose. That's polite. I'm trying not to be. Then don't. He looked directly at her. Thinner. The kitchen went quiet except for water dripping from the edge of the basin. Martha nodded once. Daniel went on. I imagined someone narrow and delicate. I don't know why. You never described yourself that way. No. I did it for you. Yes. He leaned his hands against the counter. When I saw you, the picture didn't match, and instead of realizing the picture was the foolish part, I started wondering whether you were. Martha looked down at the plate in her hands. Daniel's voice lowered. I am ashamed of that. She rinsed the plate. Set it aside. Good. He blinked. Martha faced him. I'm not going to make that easier for you. I don't expect you to. I've spent enough years helping men feel better after they insulted me. Daniel nodded. Then don't. The answer surprised her. She studied his face. He did not look wounded. He looked uncomfortable. There was a difference. Martha dried her hands. I don't know if I forgive you yet. I know. You keep saying that. Because I'm beginning to. She almost looked away. Did not. Daniel pulled out one of the kitchen chairs. "Sit with me," and it was not an order. Martha looked toward the stove. The fire was low and steady. Everything that needed washing had been washed. She sat. Daniel took the chair across from her. Between them stood the scarred pine table where flour had been rolled, receipts checked, coffee poured, and arguments avoided. For a while neither spoke. Outside, cattle shifted in the lower pasture. A bell on one of the lead cows rang once, then went still. Daniel folded his hands. "My brother Samuel used to sit here." Martha looked at him. He had never spoken about his brother directly. "I know he died." Daniel nodded. 5 years ago. He stared at a knot in the tabletop. "He was better with people than I am." Martha said nothing. He'd walk into a room and know what everyone needed. "I used to think it was a waste of time." Daniel rubbed his thumb against the wood. Then he was gone and the house got quiet. His eyes lifted. "You came here and the men started laughing again." Martha's expression changed slightly. Daniel continued. "That frightened me." "Why?" "Because I liked it." Martha waited. "And because once I liked it, there was something I could lose." There it was. Not polished. Not romantic. True. Martha looked toward the dark window. "Daniel, I'm not Samuel." "I know. I'm not here to replace anyone." "I know that too." She turned back. "Then what are you asking me for?" Daniel did not answer immediately. His hand rested on the table between them. "Palm down." Then he slowly turned it over. Palm upward. Not reaching. Offering. "I'm asking for time to stop being an idiot." Martha stared at his hand. A laugh escaped her before she could stop it. Quiet. Real. Daniel's mouth softened. "That sounds more reasonable than most proposals I've heard." "It wasn't a proposal, I know." They sat there. His hand stayed where it was. Martha could have ignored it. She nearly did. Then she placed her fingers lightly across his palm. Daniel did not close his hand around hers. Not at first. He let her decide the weight. Her fingers rested there. Warm against rough skin. Outside, one of the cattle bawled in the moonlit pasture. A horse answered from the barn. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee grounds, onions, and the peppermint Martha had dried beside the stove. Daniel looked at their hands, then at her. Martha met his eyes. Neither moved. There was no kiss, no promise, no agreement about marriage. Just two people sitting at a work-scarred table after everyone else had gone to bed, allowing something uncertain to exist without demanding that it become anything more. After a while, Daniel's fingers closed gently around hers. Martha let them. For the first time since Cedar Hollow, she was not thinking about whether Daniel Foster would choose her. The question had changed. Now Daniel was the one waiting, and Martha was deciding whether he had earned the right to be chosen. For 3 days, nothing dramatic happened. That was almost a relief. Daniel did not speak again about the evening at the kitchen table. Martha did not mention their hands resting together in the lamplight. They went back to the practical rhythm of Broken Spur, except something small had shifted between them. When Daniel came in for coffee before sunrise, he no longer stood at the far end of the room. When Martha handed him a mug, his fingers sometimes brushed hers. Neither apologized. Autumn moved deeper into Wyoming. The cottonwoods along Cottonwood Creek turned yellow, then began dropping leaves into the water. Frost silvered the north side of the barn roof before dawn. In the mountains, snow had begun gathering along the upper ridges, white against dark stone. George Miller said winter was coming early. Frank Ellis said George said that every year. Then the rain came. It began on a Tuesday afternoon. Martha was sorting potatoes in the root cellar when she heard the first drops striking the tin gutter along the back porch. By supper, the yard had become mud. By midnight, the rain had not stopped. Daniel stood on the front porch in his heavy coat, watching water stream down the wagon road. Martha opened the door behind him. "You planning to stare it dry?" He glanced back. "Creek's rising." "How bad?" "Hard to tell in the dark." Thunder rolled somewhere west. Not sharp, deep. Daniel looked toward the line of cottonwoods beyond the south pasture. "If it keeps raining through morning, we'll have trouble." It kept raining. At 4:30, George pounded on the front door. Daniel was downstairs before Martha left her room. Cottonwoods over the lower bank. Daniel pulled on his boots. "Fence?" "South section already down." "How many cattle?" "Can't tell." Daniel grabbed his slicker. Martha stood at the bottom of the stairs. "What do you need?" He looked at her. For one heartbeat, she saw the old instinct in him. Protect. Separate. Decide for her. Then it passed. "Coffee." "How much?" "Everything you can make." Martha nodded. Daniel went out into the rain. Within 20 minutes, the cookhouse was awake. Frank worked one-handed beside her, measuring grounds into the big enamel pot. Pete hauled water. Martha filled biscuit dough with pieces of leftover beef because men working in cold rain needed more than plain bread. Outside, horses were saddled under lantern light. George shouted names. Roy Turner came through the kitchen dripping from the brim of his hat. Creek took another post. Martha wrapped 6 biscuits in cloth and handed them to him. "Eat. I ain't hungry. Then put them in your pocket and become hungry later." Roy took them. "Yes, ma'am." He was gone again. By sunrise, Cottonwood Creek no longer looked like a creek. Brown water spread across the lower pasture, carrying branches, grass, and pieces of broken fence. The current had torn 2 sections of wire free and pushed cattle toward higher ground. Daniel and his men rode through freezing rain for most of the day. Martha saw them only in glimpses, a rider appearing through gray sheets of water, a horse splashing across the yard, George coming inside long enough to gulp coffee before leaving again. Around noon, Pete returned supporting Caleb Dunn beneath one arm. Caleb's face was pale. His shirt was soaked. "What happened?" Martha asked. "Horse slipped near the east draw." Caleb pressed one arm against his ribs. "I'm fine." "Sit." "Martha, sit." He sat. Frank raised an eyebrow. "She's getting worse." Martha ignored him. She checked Caleb carefully. Nothing appeared badly out of place, but every breath made him wince. "You'll stay inside. We're short men. Then they'll be short one more if you make yourself useless." Caleb looked toward Frank. Frank shrugged. "I've learned not to argue." Martha brought Caleb a blanket and hot broth. An hour later, George came back, alone. Martha looked past him through the doorway. "Where's Daniel?" "Still south." George removed his wet hat. "We lost a horse." Martha's hands stopped. "Whose?" "Daniel's spare bay. Got loose when the bank gave way." "Daniel?" "Fine." The word came quickly. Martha went back to cutting onions. Only after George turned away did she release the breath she had been holding. Daniel returned near dark. Mud covered him from boots to shoulders. Water ran from his hat. One sleeve had torn at the elbow. Martha was standing over the stove. Their eyes met. Neither spoke for a second. Then she said, "You're dripping on my floor." Daniel looked down. "I've been wetter outside." He almost smiled. She handed him a towel. That was all. But when their fingers touched, Martha held the cloth a fraction longer than necessary. Daniel noticed. He said nothing. The second day was worse. The rain continued through the night, and the south fence disappeared under water. Several hundred cattle had to be pushed toward the limestone rise west of the creek. The Cedar Hollow freight road washed out near Miller's Crossing. That mattered in a different way. The supply wagon due Friday would not make it. Martha learned this from George when he came in at noon with a broken gate latch in his hand. "Road's gone? Enough of it. When can they repair it?" George shook his head. "Depends when the water drops." Martha looked toward the pantry. Frank saw her expression. "We're not empty, no." "But?" She didn't answer. After lunch, she began counting. Flour first, then beans, potatoes, salt pork, coffee, dried apples, preserved peaches, cornmeal, onions, lard. She wrote each amount on a scrap of brown wrapping paper. Frank leaned against the pantry door. "You counting us into starvation?" "I'm counting us away from it." He became quiet. By the time Daniel returned that evening, Martha had spread the entire problem across the kitchen table. A half sack of flour, 2 sacks of cornmeal, beans in a tin measure, potatoes counted by weight, 3 sides of salt pork, several jars of vegetables, coffee enough for perhaps 10 days if used carefully. Daniel came in with George. Both men looked exhausted. Daniel removed his wet coat. "We may have to butcher another steer." "No." He looked at Martha. She stood at the table with the ranch ledger open beside the food list. "No? We don't need to. We have 14 men eating here. 13 while Caleb's down. He still eats. Then 14. Daniel rubbed one hand over his face. "The freight road could be closed a week." "I know. Maybe longer." "I know that too." George remained near the door. Frank stood by the stove. Nobody spoke. Martha turned the paper around. "I've calculated 5 days at our regular use." Daniel studied the figures. "And after that?" 7 to 9 if I change the meals." "How much?" "Enough that they'll notice." Daniel pulled out a chair. Martha pointed to the list. "No biscuits every morning. Cornmeal more often. Beans become the main dish instead of a side. Beef stretched through stew rather than served in full portions. Dried fruit only where it earns its keep. Coffee stays because taking coffee away from wet cowboys would probably start a mutiny." George nodded. "She's right about that." Daniel did not smile. His eyes stayed on the figures. "What if the road doesn't open in 9 days?" "Then we make another calculation." Daniel looked up. Martha continued. "But killing another steer today wastes something we may need later. We have enough. Not plenty." She touched the ledger. "Enough." Daniel leaned back. Rain rattled the window behind him. Months earlier, he had looked at Martha in a crowded cookhouse and asked whether she could feed his men. The memory passed between them without either speaking it. Martha folded her arms. "If you trust me completely, I can stretch this until the road opens." Daniel did not look toward George, did not ask Frank, did not check her numbers again. He looked only at Martha. "Tell me what you need." The words were simple. Martha's shoulders lowered slightly. "First, I need everyone to stop taking food from the pantry without telling me." George looked toward Frank. Frank raised his good hand. "Not me." "Second, I need an exact head count morning and evening. If men are riding out, I need to know before I cook." Daniel nodded. Done. Third, I need someone to bring in the potatoes from the far root cellar for the ground freezes harder. I'll send Roy and Pete. And no one complains about portions to me. George smiled faintly. That one might be harder. Daniel turned toward him. They won't. Martha looked at Daniel. There was no hesitation in his face, no calculation, no question about whether she could manage, only trust. Outside, the creek kept raging through the darkness. Fence posts were gone. A horse had been lost. One cowboy was lying upstairs with bruised ribs. The road to Cedar Hollow had disappeared under mud and water. Broken Spur had fewer supplies than Daniel liked, and winter waiting in the mountains. Yet for the first time since Martha arrived, none of that made her feel as though she were being tested. Daniel rose from the table. What else? Martha looked down at her list, then back at him. Eat something. I'm not hungry. She pointed toward a bowl beside the stove. Daniel stared at it. George cleared his throat. Daniel sat. Martha set the bowl in front of him. Beef stew, stretched with potatoes and onions. He took the first spoonful. Martha returned to her ledger. Neither mentioned what had happened. They did not need to. Weeks earlier, Daniel had asked whether Martha was capable of feeding his ranch. Now the creek had taken fences, roads, and nearly every illusion of control a cattleman could possess. And Daniel Foster had placed one of the most important parts of Broken Spur Ranch directly into Martha's hands. She did not waste the trust. The next morning, breakfast changed. There were no biscuits. Instead, Martha served cornmeal mush cooked thick with milk, a little molasses, and pieces of fried salt pork on the side. Men looked at the bowls, then at one another. Roy Turner lifted his spoon. This winter already? Martha poured coffee into his mug. Unless you'd prefer to chew the table. Roy tasted the cornmeal. He took another spoonful. Table can wait. That was the closest anyone came to complaining. For the next week, the kitchen ran by calculation. Martha used beef in stews instead of thick slices. She saved every bit of fat from the roasting pans and clarified it for frying. Stale bread became pudding with dried apples and a little cinnamon. Beans appeared often enough that Pete Lawson began calling Wednesday Bean Day, though Martha pointed out that Tuesday had also been Bean Day. Coffee stayed. On that point, she did not bend. Daniel noticed she began measuring the grounds with the same tin cup every morning. 1 cup for each pot. No more. No less. What happens when you run out? He asked. Martha kept pouring boiling water. I become unpopular. You already survived Roy. Coffee is more dangerous than Roy. From the table, Roy called, I heard that. You were meant to. By the 6th day, the rain had stopped, but cold came down hard from the mountains. Mud froze in wagon ruts. Cottonwood Creek dropped back inside its banks, leaving broken branches tangled through the south pasture and fence wire buried under brown grass. The freight road remained closed. Men worked from first light until dark rebuilding what the water had taken. Every night they came back stiff, cold, and hungry. Every night there was something hot waiting. Not much. Enough. Daniel began bringing Martha information before she had to ask for it. 11 men for supper. George and Pete will be late. Or, Caleb's riding again tomorrow. Or, we'll have 2 extra hands from the Miller place helping with fence. At first, he stood in the kitchen doorway when he told her. Then he started coming to the table. One evening, Martha found him already seated with the ranch ledger open beside 2 freight receipts. You've entered the Cedar Hollow order twice, she said. Daniel frowned. I did not. She turned the book around. He looked, then sighed. Apparently I did. Martha sat across from him. You're tired. So are you. I'm not putting $40 in two places. Not yet. She gave him a look. Daniel smiled. The smile came easier now. That was another change. Their evenings began stretching longer after the dishes were done. Martha would bring the books to the kitchen table. Daniel would sit with a pencil behind one ear and a coffee mug cooling beside his elbow. They discussed cattle prices, feed, the cost of replacing fence wire, whether it made sense to sell 30 head before the ground froze harder. Daniel asked her opinion, not because he wanted to be polite, because he wanted the answer. Sometimes their shoulders touched while they leaned over the same page. Neither moved. One night, Martha pointed to a figure in the ledger. That supplier charged you 12 cents more per pound for coffee. Daniel leaned closer. Where? Here. His sleeve brushed hers. They both stopped, not visibly enough that anyone else would have noticed. But no one else was there. Daniel looked at her hand resting beside the ledger. Martha kept her eyes on the numbers. You're staring at the wrong column. I know. She looked at him then. He sat back slowly. Neither mentioned it. Outside, the first real snow began falling. By morning, Broken Spur was white from the barn roofs to the lower pasture. The damaged freight road finally reopened 2 days later. A wagon came through from Cedar Hollow around noon, wheels packed with frozen mud. The driver brought flour, coffee, oats, salt pork, lamp oil, 2 crates of canned goods, and a sack of late apples that had survived the trip better than expected. Roy helped unload. He carried the apple sack into the kitchen himself. Then he stood there with both hands on it. Martha looked up, put it by the pantry. Roy did not move. Something wrong? He rubbed the back of his neck. No. Martha waited. Roy looked at the floor, then at the apples. Some of these came off a wagon that broke down west of Cedar Hollow. All right. I bought the sack. Martha's eyebrows lifted. Why? Roy's face tightened as though the answer offended him. Because I wanted to. She waited. He exhaled. And because I was a fool. The kitchen went still. Frank, sitting near the stove with his healing wrist, wisely found the coffee pot very interesting. Roy continued. First week you were here, I made jokes, I remember. Figured you wouldn't last. I remember that too. He nodded. Wasn't my finest thinking. Martha looked at the apples, then back at him, no. Roy almost smiled. I don't know how to say this proper. You've started. He swallowed. I'm sorry. Martha let the silence sit long enough that he had to remain inside it. Then she untied the sack. She took out one apple, turned it in her hand. These are good. Roy looked relieved. Yeah. Then you can help peel them tonight. His relief vanished. How many? All of them. Frank laughed into his mug. Roy glared at him. Martha handed Roy a knife. That evening, apple pudding appeared after supper. Roy ate 2 portions. No one commented on why. The winter settled in around them. Days shortened. Mornings came black and bitter. Men broke ice in the troughs before sunrise. Horses breathed clouds into the barn aisles. Woodpiles shrank and were rebuilt. The house windows filmed with frost around the edges. And through it all, Martha and Daniel moved toward one another by inches. He left a fresh pair of wool socks outside her door when he noticed hers drying near the stove with a hole in the heel. She mended the torn lining in his heavy coat without mentioning it. He began bringing her the first mail before opening his own. She learned he hated cloves. He learned she drank coffee with 1 spoon of sugar only when she was tired. One evening, Daniel returned late from checking the west pasture. Snow clung to his shoulders. Martha was standing on the porch beneath the lantern. He stopped at the bottom step. "You've been waiting?" The stove was too warm. Daniel looked toward the kitchen window. "Window's open." Martha glanced back. It was. He climbed the steps. For a moment, they stood close enough that she could smell cold air, leather, and wood smoke on his coat. Daniel took off his hat. "Martha." She looked at him. The lantern flame moved in the wind. He did not reach for her. "May I kiss you?" The question landed more softly than she expected. Martha's fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. She thought of Cedar Hollow, the hesitation beside the stagecoach, the cookhouse question, the apology, the repaired step. The hand turned palm upward on the table. The words, "Tell me what you need." Daniel waited. No pressure, no assumption. Martha stepped closer. "Yes." He kissed her carefully, almost too carefully. His hand came to rest at her waist only after she leaned toward him. The kiss was brief, warm, real. When they separated, Daniel did not smile right away. Neither did Martha. They simply looked at one another in the lantern light. Then Martha said, "Your supper's getting cold." Daniel's mouth finally curved. "I expected that." "You should." She went inside. He followed. For the first time, the future did not feel like something either of them had to discuss before allowing themselves to enjoy the present. That lasted until the following Thursday. Daniel came in from the barn shortly before noon and stopped in the front hall. Martha's brown canvas trunk stood beside the door, strapped shut, the same trunk he had lifted from the stagecoach in Cedar Hollow. For several seconds, Daniel did not move. Snow melted from his boots onto the floorboards. Martha came down the stairs, carrying her gloves. She saw him looking at the trunk. Neither spoke. The warmth of the previous weeks seemed suddenly very far away. Daniel lifted his eyes to hers. "Why is that packed?" Martha held the banister. Outside, somewhere beyond the frozen yard, the weekly stage bell sounded faintly from the road, and Daniel understood that the kiss beneath the porch lantern had not settled the question between them at all. He looked at the trunk, then at Martha. "Why is that packed?" Her fingers tightened around the gloves in her hand. "The road is open." "I know. The stage is running again." "I know that too." Daniel took one step toward her and stopped. "That doesn't answer me." Martha came down the last stair. She wore the same brown traveling coat she had arrived in, though the blue ribbon was no longer pinned at the collar. Her hair was neatly arranged. Her face was calm in the way Daniel had learned to distrust. Calm meant she had already made the hard part of the decision somewhere private. "I bought passage for Saturday." Daniel stared at her. "This Saturday?" "Yes." "Back to Iowa. Back east first. I'll decide the rest from there." The words struck with surprising force. Daniel looked toward the front window. Outside, Pete was leading 2 horses past the barn. Roy stood near the woodpile, splitting kindling. Everything at Broken Spur looked exactly as it had 10 minutes earlier. Daniel had never hated ordinary movement more. "When were you going to tell me?" "Today. After you packed. I needed to know I could do it before I spoke." Daniel's jaw worked once. "Do what?" "Leave." The house seemed very quiet. Martha looked at the trunk instead of him. "I thought after the other night I might not need to." Daniel's voice lowered. The kiss. Not just that, she set the gloves on top of the trunk. These last weeks, Daniel waited. You ask me about the cattle now, about supplies, about the books. You trust me. Yes. You respect my work. Yes. You look at me differently. Daniel stepped closer, because I see you differently. Martha's eyes lifted to his. That's the problem. He stopped. She drew in a slow breath. I don't know what part you're seeing. Daniel frowned. Martha, no, listen. He did. Her voice remained even. Every time you tell me why you want me here, you tell me what I do. Daniel opened his mouth. She lifted one hand. He closed it again. You say the ranch runs better. The books are cleaner. The men eat better. The house feels different. You tell me I'm capable. Strong. Useful. She gave the last word more weight. Daniel heard it. Martha continued. Those are good things. They are true. I know. Her eyes shone, but she did not look away. That's what frightens me. Daniel stood silent. I have spent most of my life being wanted for what I can carry. She touched the top of the trunk lightly. A kitchen, an account book. Someone else's burden, a room full of hungry men. Her hand fell. I cannot marry a man because he finally discovered I am convenient. Daniel flinched. That isn't what this is. I want to believe you. Then believe me. The words came too quickly. Martha's face tightened. Daniel regretted them before the sound had fully left the room. He removed his hat and rubbed a hand across his forehead. That came out wrong. Yes, I'm trying. I know. Again, that terrible mercy. Daniel stepped nearer. Martha, I kissed you because I wanted to. I know. I didn't ask because you balanced my books. A faint breath of laughter escaped her, sad rather than amused. I would hope not. He almost smiled. Almost. Then it was gone. You said yes. I did. Did you want me to? Yes. The answer stopped him. Martha looked toward the window. That's why I have to go. Daniel stared. If I didn't care, this would be easy. Outside, an axe struck wood. Once, twice, then stopped. Martha lowered her voice. I love you. Daniel did not move. She had never said it before. Neither had he. The words seemed to change the room around them. Daniel's hand closed slowly around the brim of his hat. Martha continued before he could answer. I love the man who fixed a loose step instead of asking me to forgive him before I was ready. The man who learned to wait for me at the table. The man who stopped asking whether I could handle something and started asking what I needed. Her mouth trembled once. She pressed it still. But I need to know whether that man loves Martha Collins. Daniel stepped toward her. He does. Or whether he loves what Martha Collins has done to Broken Spur. His feet stopped. She watched his face. That was the cruelty of an honest question. It did not always leave room for an immediate answer. Daniel searched for words. The ranch is better because of you. Martha closed her eyes briefly. He heard himself. Too late. That's exactly what I mean. Martha, you see? No, I mean, you mean well. She picked up her gloves. But meaning well is not enough for a marriage. Daniel looked at the trunk again. For the first time since his brother's death, he felt something close to panic. Not loud, not wild, just a cold certainty spreading through him that something precious was moving beyond his reach while he stood in the same room, unable to name why it mattered. What can I say? Martha looked at him. Nothing today. Daniel's face hardened slightly. Not toward her. Toward helplessness. You've decided. I've decided to leave. That's the same thing. No. She looked toward the kitchen. I've decided I need distance from this place before I can trust my own answer. Daniel stared at her. And if your answer is not me? Martha swallowed. Then it isn't. He looked away. That hurt more than anger would have. Saturday came clear and bitter. The kind of Wyoming morning when every sound traveled far because the air seemed made of glass. The stage was due at 9. By 8:30, Martha's trunk stood beside the ranch gate. George had carried it there without asking questions. Henry Cole arrived with a small paper packet of peppermint for the journey. Trains make my stomach bad, he said. Might help. Martha took it. Thank you. He touched the brim of his hat, then stepped away quickly. Pete stood near the barn pretending to adjust a saddle strap that had already been adjusted 3 times. Roy came out last. He had no apples this time. He shoved his hands into his coat pockets. You sure? Martha looked at him. About what? Roy frowned. Leaving. I bought the ticket. Didn't answer me. She almost smiled. No. I'm not sure. Roy nodded. Good. Good? Would have been worse if you were. He walked away before she could answer. Daniel remained on the porch. He had barely spoken to her since Thursday. Not out of punishment. Every time he opened his mouth, he heard the same failures. You made the ranch better. You saved us money. The men trust you. You can feed 20. Every sentence turned Martha into a list of services. He knew she deserved something else. He did not know what that something was. At 8:55, the stage appeared on the road. 4 horses. A yellow coach darkened by winter grime. The bell at the harness rang softly as it approached. Daniel came down from the porch. Martha stood beside her trunk. Neither looked toward the men. The driver climbed down. Mrs. Collins? Miss. Right. He checked the passenger sheet. Cedar Hollow. Then eastbound connection. Yes. He loaded her trunk onto the rear rack. Daniel watched the rope tighten around it. The same brown canvas. The same brass corners. Only months earlier he had lifted it from another stage and wondered what kind of woman carried so many books. Now the driver tied it to a vehicle that would take her away from him. Martha picked up her recipe box. Daniel's throat tightened. That box had sat beside his stove, on his kitchen table, beside her elbow while she checked his ledgers. He had begun thinking of it as part of the house. The driver opened the coach door. Martha turned to Daniel. No one else moved. Thank you, she said. Daniel frowned. For what? For listening eventually. He could not answer. Martha stepped toward the coach. He caught her hand. Not hard. Just enough. She stopped. Daniel looked down at their joined hands, then released her. I'm sorry, I know. I don't mean for Cedar Hollow. I know. For all of it. Martha's eyes softened. That matters. She climbed into the coach. Daniel stepped back. The driver shut the door. Pete looked toward the ground. George's jaw tightened. Henry took off his hat. Roy said nothing. The driver climbed onto the box. He gathered the reins. Daniel stood in the road. The horses shifted. Leather creaked. The driver raised his hand. "Ready?" Martha's face appeared behind the small coach window. Daniel looked at her. Then something inside him finally became clear. Broken Spur had existed before Martha. It could exist after her. The cattle would still need feeding. The books could be balanced. Frank's wrist would heal. Someone else could cook. Someone else could fill a chair. For months, Daniel had been trying to explain Martha's importance by naming everything she had changed. He had never understood that love began where usefulness ended. The driver lifted the reins. Daniel stepped forward. "Wait." The driver looked down. Martha went still behind the glass. Daniel reached inside his coat. His fingers closed around a folded document he had carried there for weeks. The unused marriage license. And at last, Daniel knew exactly what he needed to do with it. The driver held the reins loose in both hands. The horses shifted against their traces, breath rising white in the cold morning. Martha sat behind the coach window with the wooden recipe box on her lap. Daniel stepped closer. George, Roy, Henry, and Pete remained near the ranch gate. No one pretended not to listen. Daniel unfolded the paper. The county seal was pressed faintly into one corner. His name stood beside hers in black ink. Daniel Foster. Martha Collins. A promise arranged before either of them had understood what they were promising. Martha watched him through the open coach window. "Daniel?" He looked at the paper. Then he tore it in half. The sound was small, sharp. It carried farther than he expected in the frozen morning. Martha's eyes widened. Daniel tore the halves again. The driver lowered his hands. No one spoke. Daniel held the 4 pieces between his fingers. Broken Spur was here before you came. Martha did not move. The cattle were here. The house was here. George kept the men working. Frank kept them fed badly enough to stay alive. From behind him came Frank's distant voice from the porch. "I heard that." Nobody laughed. Not yet. Daniel kept his eyes on Martha. The ranch would keep going if you left. Her mouth tightened slightly. The books would get done. Someone would cook. The fence would be fixed. Men would complain and eat anyway. He swallowed. "I could survive it." Martha's fingers closed around the recipe box. Daniel stepped nearer. "But I don't want a life that's only about surviving." Silence settled over the yard. A strand of Martha's hair had loosened near her cheek. Daniel noticed it. He noticed the blue stitching at the thumb of her glove, the fine crease beside her eyes, the way she pressed her lips together when she was trying not to let him see too much. None of those things had anything to do with biscuits. "I don't want you because you fixed my accounts." Martha looked down. "I don't want you because you fed 20 men in a storm." Her eyes lifted again. "I don't want you because you stretched supplies when Cottonwood took the road." Daniel's voice became quieter. "I want you when you tell me I'm wrong." Roy looked toward George. George gave him a warning glance. Daniel continued. "I want you when you're tired and don't feel like being pleasant. I want the woman who drinks bad coffee without complaining until she knows a man well enough to insult it. The woman who moves the butter closer to Henry and never tells anybody why." Henry cleared his throat and looked away. "I want the woman who laughed at Roy's mule story even though she knew it was nonsense." "It happened," Roy muttered. Nobody acknowledged him. Martha's eyes were shining now. Daniel took another step. "I want the woman who sat across from me at that table and made me tell the truth when I'd spent 38 years learning how not to." He looked down at the torn license. This paper belonged to 2 people who had never met. He let the pieces fall into his coat pocket. I don't want that bargain anymore. Martha's voice was barely above the wind. What do you want? Daniel looked directly at her. You. Nothing else, no ranch, no kitchen, no ledger. Just the word. Martha looked away toward the bighorns. Snow lay pale along the distant ridges. The lower slopes were brown and gold beneath the morning sun. The driver shifted on the box. Ma'am, I do need to keep schedule. Daniel nodded. He stepped back from the coach. Martha turned quickly. He did not reach for the door. Did not ask her to stay again. You should go if you need to go, he said. Her face changed. Daniel kept his hands at his sides. If you come back, I want it to be because you chose to. The driver looked at Martha. She looked at Daniel. Then she pulled the coach door shut. Daniel's chest tightened. The reins snapped lightly. The horses moved. Pete swore under his breath. Henry stared at the ground. Roy looked as though he wanted to say something and wisely did not. Daniel watched the stage roll toward Cedar Hollow. Martha's face remained at the window until the wagon turned beyond the cottonwoods. Then she was gone. For 3 days, Broken Spur felt wrong. Not empty. Wrong. Frank returned to most of his kitchen duties, though his wrists still bothered him. George kept the crew moving. Roy complained about the coffee. Pete ate everything placed in front of him. The ranch survived exactly as Daniel had said it would. That did not help. On the 3rd morning, Daniel entered the kitchen before sunrise. The lamp on the table was already lit. He stopped. A wooden box sat beside his coffee cup. Dark walnut. One hinge repaired with a thin strip of tin. Daniel did not breathe for a second. Then he crossed the room, Martha's recipe box. On top lay one sheet of paper. He picked it up. In Martha's neat handwriting were 4 words. Foster Wedding Supper, 31 plates. Daniel read it twice. Behind him, the kitchen door opened. He turned. Martha stood there in her brown coat. No trunk, no traveling gloves. Just Martha. Daniel stared at her. She closed the door carefully. You counted 31? He asked. George gave me the final number. Daniel looked at the paper. That's your answer? No. He raised his eyes. Martha stepped closer. This is, she reached for his hand. Daniel let her take it. I came back because I chose you. His fingers closed around hers. Martha looked at him. And because Frank's biscuits are terrible. From the pantry came Frank's voice. I heard that too. Daniel laughed. This time Martha did not try to hide hers. They were married 12 days later beneath the cottonwoods near the south pasture. The ground had frozen hard enough that chair legs had to be wedged with scraps of wood. A cold wind came down from the mountains, but the sky stayed clear. George stood beside Daniel. Henry wore a clean black coat too large through the shoulders. Pete had polished his boots until they looked almost respectable. Roy arrived early and denied doing so. Frank supervised the food with his wrist still wrapped, though everyone knew Martha had prepared most of it. There were 31 plates. Exactly. When the preacher asked Daniel whether he took Martha Collins as his lawful wife, Daniel looked at her before answering. I do. Martha's eyes held his. I do. No hesitation. Afterward, the crew crowded around the long tables beneath the cottonwoods. There was beef, beans, potatoes, biscuits, apple cobbler, enough coffee to keep Roy from mutiny. Henry ate 2 biscuits and said nothing, which Martha took as approval. Daniel found her near the end of the table after sunset. She was cutting the last of the cobbler. You've been working at your own wedding. People still have to eat. He took the knife gently from her hand. Sit. Martha looked at him. Daniel pulled out the chair beside his. This time she did not argue. Years passed. The cottonwoods grew thicker. The fence along Cottonwood Creek was rebuilt twice. Frank eventually retired to Cedar Hollow and spent most afternoons claiming every cook after him had ruined the profession. Pete became foreman after George's knees finally convinced him that horseback work was no longer a sensible way to spend winter mornings. Roy married a schoolteacher who did not believe his mule story either, and Broken Spur became known along the cattle roads for one simple thing: nobody left hungry. One November evening, long after sunset, a young rider appeared at the gate. He could not have been more than 17. His coat was too thin. His horse looked tired. The boy removed his hat when Daniel opened the door. "Sir, I was wondering if there's work." Daniel looked past him toward the dark road. "You eaten?" The boy hesitated. "Yesterday." Martha heard from the kitchen. She came to the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Bring him in." The boy looked embarrassed. "I don't have money." Martha crossed to the stove. She filled a bowl with beef stew. Steam rose thick into the lamplight. Then she set it at the table. "Sit." The boy lowered himself carefully. Daniel pulled out the chair opposite him. The boy looked from one to the other. "What do I owe you?" Martha pushed the bread closer. "Eat first." The boy stared. "We'll settle everything else afterward." He picked up the spoon. For a moment, the room went quiet. Daniel leaned against the counter. Martha looked across at him. Years earlier, she had stepped from a stagecoach wearing a blue ribbon while Daniel Foster stood in the street, deciding what her appearance meant. He had spent weeks asking whether she could fit into the life he had built. He had been wrong. Martha had never needed to prove she deserved a place at Broken Spur. She had shown Daniel what the place could become: a table where Henry could remember his wife without embarrassment, a kitchen where Roy could apologize badly and still be heard, a house where tired men laughed again, a home where a hungry stranger was fed before anyone asked what he could give in return. Daniel reached across the counter. Martha placed her hand in his. The boy kept eating. Outside, snow began falling softly beyond the window. Inside, the stove burned steady through the night, and at Broken Spur Ranch, nobody's worth had to be measured before someone pulled out a chair. But before we leave Broken Spur Ranch, imagine yourself standing where Martha once stood, with your trunk packed, your heart already attached to someone, and one painful question left unanswered. Do they love you for who you are, or only for what you can give them? Martha had spent years being valued for capable hands, good cooking, and the burdens she could carry without complaint. What she needed from Daniel was something harder to prove. She needed to know she could set all those things down and still be wanted. And Daniel finally understood. Love wasn't Martha earning a chair at his table. It was Daniel pulling out that chair before asking what she could bring to it. Maybe that's why their story stays with us. Sometimes a second chance doesn't arrive through grand promises. Sometimes it comes through a repaired step, an open hand across a kitchen table, an apology spoken without excuses, and the courage to let someone walk away rather than hold them with obligation. If you've ever had to choose between being needed and being truly loved, tell us in the comments what Martha's decision meant to you. And if stories of second chances, quiet courage, mystery, and healing still have a place in your heart, subscribe and stay with us. There are many more stories waiting down the trail.